So hello everyone, I am Yvonne Kim, Executive Director of Asia Society Korea. I am very pleased to welcome all of you and to host today's exclusive conversation on the U.S. Korea cooperation during the pandemic. Our conversation today will focus on the U.S. Korea cooperation during the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected international relations and also caused certain diplomatic tensions. Today, we will discuss how the pandemic poses diplomatic challenges for the long-existing U.S.-Korea alliance. As you may very well know, today's speaker, Mr. Marc Knapper, brings an extensive knowledge of the Republic of Korea and the Asia-Pacific region to his current assignment. He is currently Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Japan and Korea, and prior to that, he was in Seoul as Charge of Affairs from 2017 to 2018, and Deputy Chief of Mission from 2015 to 2016. He has always been a loyal and generous friend of ours at Asia Society Korea, and it's always good to see him, and we thank you very much, Mark, for your ongoing contributions. Today's conversation will be moderated by an Asia 21 fellow, John Delury, our in-house expert in U.S.-China relations and Korean Peninsula affairs. He is currently an associate professor of Chinese studies at Yonsei University Graduate School of International Studies. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation, so I will hand over the mic to you now, John. Good morning.
Well, thank you, Yvonne. Good morning to you. Good morning, Mark. Good morning, everyone out there. This is, even though we can't see everyone's faces, we see names and we can feel your presence and many friends out there in the audience. And I'm certainly delighted and honored to be a part of this event. It's so timely, and we really are grateful, Mark, that you're making time late night from your home there in DC to talk to us, waking up mostly in Asia, eager to get into things. But it's a very timely discussion of the U.S.-Korea relationship, and you're the perfect person to talk about it. So I have a mix of questions. We'll go from easy to harder. And then we'll have, I'm sure, stimulating questions from the group as well. So I thought we could dive into it and begin, with maybe the core of this topic is U.S.-Korea cooperation in the midst of this pandemic. And I wonder if you could, still kind of briefly, but paint a picture for us of where you've seen significant cooperation and maybe focusing on the issue at hand, this global public health crisis. I mean, we've seen the news here of the test kits in Maryland. I've heard about ways in which the Korean National Election Commission, has been helping states in terms of preparing for November's election. And there are other little bits and pieces, pretty interesting examples of cooperation. I wonder if you could kind of put it together and ways in which you've seen this terrible event for the world actually strengthen the relationship.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, John. It's a great question. Thank you again, Yvonne, and your team at the Asia Society Korea for setting this up. It's really great to be part of this, and it's great to see so many friends and colleagues as well out there tuning in. So do appreciate it. But yes, I think, I've said this sort of in different fora, but the idea that certainly this has been a crisis, but it's also been a real opportunity for the relationship and for the alliance. And I think we in the Republic of Korea have I think shown the quality of our friendship through our cooperation and in terms of dealing with this. And I think we really were able to rely on what I call muscle memory in how we were able to cooperate with each other. And it's just like practicing a golf swing. You do it over and over again, and it gets to the point where it's very unconscious, how well you do it. Well, in some ways, the cooperation we in South Korea enjoyed in this pandemic, I think, was muscle memory. It didn't take a lot of sort of work to think about how we would get things done, because it did come so naturally to us. And one of the reasons it did was, I think, if you go back to some previous public health crises from earlier in the decade, you can see examples of U.S. ROK public health cooperation that really helped to set the stage for this current pandemic. And by that, I'm referring to, for example, the Ebola crisis in West Africa in 2014. This was an instance in which the U.S. put out a call for friends, partners, and allies around the world to step up and send physicians, particularly military medical experts, to the hot zone. I mean, literally the hot zone there. And Korea was one of the first countries to put its hand up and step up and sent a significant number of doctors, military doctors, as well as assistants to Sierra Leone. And they're on the ground with our U.S. military folks, our U.S. military health experts. They were able to work together and develop a common understanding of how public health officials and public health experts work together in a crisis. Fast forward to the next year, 2015, with the outbreak of MERS in South Korea. And we were fortunate, and just by happy coincidence at the time, there was an American CDC doctor who happened to be in Korea working on something completely different. But when the MERS outbreak took place, he basically was able to embed himself with KCDC, which at the time was still a growing organization, and really help them with their standard operating procedures, to help them with some best practices. And I think now, when we look at what happened just in the past few months, it's been Korea whose best practices and standard operating procedures we, the United States, and many around the world came to rely on and benefit from. And when I say, you mentioned the test kits, for example. I mean, that's one example. But just looking at how Korea did things like contact tracing, these are all lessons that we are trying to learn here in the United States. Not to mention, as you also said, how do you run an election in the middle of a pandemic? I think, one of the great, I think there are two great lessons from this. One is that you don't have to be an authoritarian nation to defeat this disease. Places like Korea and Taiwan have shown us how it can be done. You can do it in an open society that's transparent and protects people's privacy. But the other lesson really is that you can also succeed as a democracy in spite of the pandemic. And we saw this with Korea's National Assembly election in mid-April. And we did indeed, subsequent to that, did one of these Zoom calls with members of Korea's National Election Committee and the folks from the 50 US states, because every state has its own election committee in our system. And so folks from the 50 states, election commissions all got online with their Korean counterparts, and there was 90 minutes of back and forth explanation of how do you run an election. We learned about how Korea expanded its mail-in voting system. We learned about how Korea spread out the voting days to allow to prevent people gathering at polling stations all in several hours on a single day. We learned about the methods that workers at polling stations took to protect themselves, that they used to protect voters. And so I think and this is what I think I guess my final point would be. This is really, for me, the essence of an alliance, right? I mean, we worked together several years ago, and we helped Korea out when we could, and this is, I think, it's just coming back and benefiting us too. So it's a real bright spot, I think, in the pretty dark time, but I think it does show the quality and strength of our two countries' friendship and trust.
Great. Yeah, I remember now. I think I saw a tweet of yours on that National Election Commission call and was delighted because that is such a critical area. As you say, that's a great phrase. The essence of the alliance. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. The difficulty level is going to go up, but you're a diplomat.
I thought you might. Yeah.
You're a diplomat. You'll have no problem, but. I mean, the elephant in the room, Mark, is everyone here is reading John Bolton, and there's quite a bit on Korea, obviously, in there. And I think something that is worth raising, this is Asia Society's mission, is to talk through stuff, to increase understanding. And if we don't put it out there, a lot of misunderstanding can actually pile up. So this is not a gotcha thing. This is a genuine raising issues that I know are being questions are being asked here. And one sort of way that I would frame it is you look at the account from John Bolton's description, And, you know, I would say two of the kind of enemies in the book are the State Department. I mean, there's a great deal of hostility toward the negotiation that's being led by the State Department of North Korea. And then also Moon Jae-in, you know, I mean, the language toward South Korea is very, very negative, very hostile. And, you know, I wonder, when you talk about the essence of the alliance, and I know you're limited in exactly what you can say, but I wonder if you could help us understand, how should we contextualize that book, you know, and the account that it's given of the fact of there being this kind of deep hostility in the dynamics between, you know, the White House and the Blue House. Do you think the account itself is flawed? Or do you think that things have changed since that particular person is no longer there, or the alliance is strong enough to withstand these things? But maybe you could try to help, because people are reading it, and so I wonder if you can put it in some context.
Well, I see my colleague from the embassy just jumped on, so I'm going to have to be extra careful here.
Oh, that's too bad. Yvonne, can you kick them out for a second?
No, I mean, look, there's a lot of things, I guess, several points I'm obligated to make. I mean, one is, both Secretary Pompeo and the president himself have already made their views about this book known. And so, for one, would have to sort of make the point that they've already spoken up pretty strongly. Another point I would make, and this isn't just a bumper sticker, but when we are engaging with our diplomatic colleagues, whether it's in South Korea, whether it's Japan, anywhere, I mean, we do take very seriously, the sort of requirement to ensure that we're not talking out of school about the kind of conversations that are going on. And so, I'll refrain from getting into specifics of or details that he raised. Suffice to say, I wasn't in every room that he claimed to be in, but yeah, I mean, it makes me uncomfortable to have to talk about details of diplomatic and sensitive conversations we have with our allies, because I think, I believe that those are meant to be very sacred conversations in a way. But I think what I would say, though, and I'm not giving anything away when I say that if and I haven't read the book either, but if I understand sort of the period of time that he discusses, I mean, one of the features of that period of time was just the intense level of dialogue that we were having with our South Korean allies. And, whether it was, the day of Moon Jae-in's election, for example, I can remember that he had a phone call, the very first phone call that President-elect Moon had was with President Trump. And I think that intense level of dialogue continued subsequent to that. And, and I'm not going to, whether, Ambassador Bolton has something for the State Department or not. I mean, again, I'm not going to comment. But I can speak from my perspective that our relationship with the NSC was always very productive. It is always productive. We have great colleagues there, and we're all working together and rowing in the same direction for the same goal, which is to manage this alliance in a way that benefits the peoples of both our countries. But at the same time, that addresses the North Korean nuclear and missile threat, that addresses tensions on the peninsula. And so I think we worked very, very closely with our South Korean counterparts, both in Seoul, sort of at the embassy level, but also my colleagues at the NSC worked very closely with their Blue House colleagues. And so, again, I mean, you deduced correctly. I probably couldn't get into too much about the contents of the book, but suffice to say that I'm very proud of, particularly during those times, the intense and very productive and deep conversations and contacts we had with the Koreans, and which still go on today. And it's both ways. I mean, it goes both ways. And this is, again, gets back to the sort of sacred trust we enjoy with each other, and it gets back to just the fact that we're allies and we're friends. And this week we count on each other, and no more so than during crises like the one we're in now.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that. I mean, having skimmed it, I would reaffirm your point that actually it's almost negative evidence. Moon Jae-in appears a lot in the book, and you see how much conversation there is between Seoul and Washington. I mean, to underscore your point, even though it's negative commentary on that, it is definitely happening throughout the narrative. The other thing I would say, and obviously I have my own views on this stuff and think that the diplomacy is constructive and that period of diplomacy was constructive. And it made me wonder, gosh, if there was a national security advisor who was supporting the State Department team's efforts, not actively undermining them, and also working, proactively, constructively with Seoul, could things have been different? The question I would ask for you is then to move this away from Bolton to now. Things have just de-escalated a tiny bit in the inner Korean space. I mean, a week ago, they were blowing up the liaison office. Now Kim Jong-un has just, kind of de-escalated, saying there won't be imminent military action. But the North Koreans have obviously brought things up. They've increased the temperature. And we're kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop on the U.S. side. What is your assessment, within the department and in circles there in Washington, to put it to our conversation, to our main topic? What do you see? What are the possibilities for the U.S. and South Korea to work together to make any kind of progress on the North Korea issue? Or do you think we're in a holding pattern for some period of time?
I mean, all I can say is, staying as in a close touch as we are with the South, I mean, we're really unified in our view that the door to diplomacy remains open, that we sincerely want to go back to June, 2018, and look at the Singapore statement, and let's see, how do we fulfill the spirit of this statement? How do we fulfill the promise of this statement? And this was a really significant thing, having President Trump meet with Chairman Kim Jong-un, and it was significant to have, first time ever sort of written affirmation of a goal of bringing peace and stability to the peninsula, denuclearizing, improving and transforming the relationship, not just between North and South Korea, but between North Korea and the United States. And so, I mean, our sincere hope remains, to fulfill the spirit of that statement, but then to fulfill the promise of Hanoi. And that, I think, we remain ready to engage in dialogue with the North, and we remain committed to a diplomatic solution to address the nuclear and the missile issues. We have to work hand in hand with the South Koreans to do this.
Do you think, Marc, that the North Koreans, their version of this history is they make a deal at the end of a democratic cycle in the U.S. or South Korea, and then the other party wins and everything is, they throw everything off the table? That's the North Korean narrative of the last 20, 30 years. And my sense in discussions is they actually probably believe that. It's self-serving, but I think to a large extent, many of their diplomats believe that, and arguably it's rooted in some truth. Now, given that, do you think that, they're kind of waiting until November, and then do the U.S. and South Korea need to factor that in, that's going to be the next window of opportunity?
Once again, I'm going to pull out a tried and true sort of State Department phrase about engaging in hypotheticals. But what I think I can say is, if you look back at 2000, when the sort of intense election year diplomacy took place, you had Marshal Cho Myung-ok came to Washington kind of late summer. What was it? August, September, I think. Subsequent to that, we had Madeleine Albright visit Pyongyang in October. You can't get more on the eve of election than October of 2000. And so I guess I would say that history has shown the North Koreans seem quite capable of engaging in an election year. But again, I'm not, I hesitate to sort of get much beyond that, just because I've been proven wrong before when it comes to making predictions about what's going to happen.
Okay, so you're leaving the possibility of an October surprise out there.
Look, I'm not sure I'd call it necessarily October surprise, given certain connotations to that expression. But I would just say we're leaving the door open to engagement and diplomacy.
Okay. So looking at other, issues in the neighborhood, and maybe I'll start with China. I think others on this call will have better questions about Japan, and you could ask yourself better questions about Japan than I could ask. But I'm sure we'll get to that. But if we start with China, obviously, the U.S.-China relationship has been going through, I don't know how we'd characterize it, a period of some kind of hardening. There's a lot more hostility in that relationship. I think that's fair to say. There's an explicit, framework of strategic competition from the U.S. government, and my perception is a much stronger consensus in the United States the need to harden the line across the board on China. And the response in the region, I think it's fair to say, in South Korea, is generally, this sort of, we don't want to choose. That's the classic. We don't want to choose. And so that paradigm is there. What are you seeing in terms of, as you're watching these dynamics with the U.S. and China unfold? It seems now maybe, well, we don't know if trade deal negotiations on or off or what. But again, beyond that, epiphenomenal stuff, there is a direction that the U.S.-China relationship is going in, that especially in economic terms can lead to some forms of decoupling, maybe not entirely, but in ways that Korea is very vulnerable to. So both on the kind of security side as well as the economic side, what's is this an area where the U.S. and Korea can still cooperate, to use our theme? Or do you think South Korea, like others in the region, need to change their framework and stop thinking of it in terms of, we don't want to choose? Do they need to make certain kinds of choices that they maybe would rather not, but just external realities force them to? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I guess I'd have a couple thoughts. One is, I think we've seen over the years, whether it's 2010, and the action China took with regard to rare earth elements following an incident with Japan in the East China Sea, whether it was China boycotting Philippine bananas after an incident involving a South China Sea territorial matter, whether it was China boycotting Norwegian salmon after the presentation of the Nobel Peace Prize to a Chinese dissident. And then most recently, whether it was China going after Korean companies such as Lotte, and then going after Korean soft power icons like K-pop stars, following, of course, the THAAD deployment in 2017. I think time and again, it should be obvious that China is maybe not necessarily Korea's friend in this matter, and I understand that certainly doesn't want to make a choice. But I think when it comes to things like shared values, when it comes to things like shared interests and shared goals, this is something the United States and Korea do talk about quite a bit, and it's something we do reflect on and try to figure out. What's the best way to deal with the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party. And I think you saw recently with after the news of the national security law potentially being promulgated in Hong Kong, South Korea came out with a strong statement about the importance of respecting the 1984 basic agreement, or the Sino-UK agreement about maintaining one country, two systems. And we very much welcome that Korea did come out with this. I think it was probably about one of the strongest things Seoul has said to express its concern about the Chinese Communist Party and what it's doing. And so this is a conversation we'll continue to have. Certainly, it doesn't take any pressure from us to convince certain South Korean companies from deciding that it's no longer profitable, or perhaps in their interest in terms of protecting intellectual property, for them to be so exposed on the mainland, and are choosing to move factories from mainland China to other places, such as Vietnam. My understanding, for example, is that the majority of Samsung's smartphone manufacturing now takes place in Vietnam as opposed to China. And I think this is a trend perhaps the South Korean companies are going to make on their own, regardless of what the United States or government in Seoul says. And so, we'll continue to engage closely with our allies here or I should say our allies there, to make sure that we're on the same page and that we're understand each other. But speaking of China, I mean, I know that certainly Sino-US competition is a big feature of the day, but I think we also want to try to, where we can, identify areas of cooperation. I mean, North Korea is obviously one of them. There's certain other areas. Afghanistan, believe it or not, is another area of U.S.-China cooperation. And so, let's call out bad behavior where we have to, but let's also try to identify areas of cooperation where we can as well.
Yeah, okay. Well, we may come back to that. I want to make sure that folks on the line get their chance to engage and participate. And got a question. I think if Glenn, are you willing to turn on your camera, or Yvonne, can you turn Glenn's camera on so he can ask himself? Or I wasn't given instructions if I should read it. I feel like the question is better coming from you. Yvonne, can we get Glenn live?
Can you hear me?
Not, oh yes, we can hear you, Glenn.
Okay, fine. Hey, Mark, good to see you.
Hey, Glenn, good seeing you.
I'm visiting Tokyo right now, and being here, obviously, there's a lot of discussion about what's going on in the peninsula, and it does seem that the relationship between Japan and South Korea has a lot of ups and downs. Right now, it seems to be a down period, and I think all of us would be interested to know, how much effort is the U.S. government making at the senior levels to encourage South Korea and Japan to work together, as when President Obama and Secretary Kerry worked with their counterparts in Japan and South Korea on the issue of comfort women. I know that on GSOMIA, that was an issue where not only at the Assistant Secretary level, but at the Cabinet Secretary level, there was a considerable activity on the part of the U.S., but more generally, beyond GSOMIA, can you give us a sense of how much is going on in terms of really encouraging the two to cooperate? Because it seems, being here in Tokyo, it really does seem that there's a lot that the U.S. could be doing. Maybe there's a lot being done beneath the surface that I don't hear about, but it does seem that there's so much that can be done and should be done. So
yeah,
that with us.
Thanks, Glenn. Well, I think it's fair to say, and it shouldn't be a surprise, that a lot of the pretty intense and high-level coordination and outreach that we did late last year, it's been difficult to keep that up, just given everything going on with the pandemic. Just in terms of being unable to travel as freely as we used to, and I think just folks are very focused on dealing with the pandemic and trying to work together and cooperate on whether it was providing test kits or PPE or helping each other's citizens who found themselves unable to travel, and so stuck in far-flung places. And in this instance, we provided support to Japan, we provided support to Korea, and in fact, Japan and Korea helped each other on some of these repatriation flights. So yeah, I mean, I think one point I would make is just that there was quite a bit of activity, but then the virus happened, and so we can make do with things like this. But as John and I were saying before the session began, it's just not the same being able to engage face to face and in person. But that being said, we do quietly and respectfully continue our outreach to both governments and to try and encourage, not just a resolution of the issues before them in a way that promotes reconciliation, but also a resolution that paves the way for a more productive and constructive relationship going forward. And I mean, I say respectfully because ultimately this is a matter that requires both countries to find a way forward. This isn't something that can be imposed from the outside by the United States. I think we can absolutely play a role. Just because we say publicly that we're not mediating or we're not taking sides or we're not getting the middle, that absolutely does not mean that we don't care. It absolutely does not mean that we're disinterested. It just means that we want to be respectful and ensure that the protagonists in this are able to find a way forward together. I think it's hopefully as things loosen up a little more and perhaps we're able to travel more and engage directly, we can begin to return to some direct contact with each other. But I know you mentioned the meeting that President Obama set up in The Hague between then President Park and Prime Minister Abe. Absolutely, that was an important event, but many people don't remember that actually President Trump had trilateral meetings with President Moon and Prime Minister Abe 3 times. And so a lot of people don't remember that we've had 3 summit-level trilateral meetings among our leaders. Not recently, of course, but certainly up to about a year and a half ago. So it's absolutely the case that we've been trying to play a role and trying to facilitate good coordination, cooperation, because then again, it gets back to shared interests, shared goals, shared values. I mean, these are 3 great democracies in Northeast Asia, in the Western Pacific, and we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our peoples, but we also owe it to the region to work together well, to I think honor the values we share, whether it's human rights or religious freedom, and to ensure that countries who wish to share these values or who have them but are perhaps under threat or coercion are able to thrive and not be forced into difficult decisions by other countries in the region.
Okay, Mark, thanks very much. I look forward to reading Bolton's book about those 3 leaders. Thanks.
Me too.
Thank you, Glenn, for the question, and Mark. It's kind of the holy grail there of the region is to get that, but you have to be careful. You can sip the wrong chalice.
That's right. Well, I saw the Indy Jones movie too. So.
Exactly. You know where I am. Okay, Tom Nagorski, can you beam in from New York? Tom has a question.
Beaming.
All right.
I think the host has stopped my video, which is probably just as well. First of all, thank you both, Mark and John, for joining us again. So John and I had a conversation just a couple of months ago, I think it is, and many others have since then, about South Korea's relative success in fighting the pandemic. And I know there have been flare-ups since then in South Korea, but compared to what we've seen here, of course, and the situations are in 100 ways very different, but nothing like what's happened here. And I just wonder, Mark, if you can say anything about lessons that you feel the U.S. has learned from the Korean experience, particularly if we're, as we keep being told, going to face another wave of this. What in terms of the Korean response is something we can draw on here in this country?
Well, thanks. I mean, I think on a couple of levels, some of the lessons, and not just from Korea, but places like Taiwan, Iceland, these are countries that shared similar experiences and similar successes in. And first of all, I think, flattening the curve. I mean, that's what it comes down to, I think, flattening the curve. And how do you do that? I mean, it's done with contact tracing. And so I think for example, in the state of New York, in the state of Illinois, a big effort going into contact tracing to essentially hire thousands of people, preferably folks who with some medical background, but if not, students, people who are interested, or perhaps medical students, to be able to trace people, folks' contact, and ensure that if there is the outbreak in a certain community or at a restaurant or bar or something, that we're able to lock it down very quickly, again, to ensure that the curve gets flattened. I think another important lesson, and one that we are, and I'm not an expert, so I don't want to misspeak, but I think just the use of technology the use of technology to track folks, and track's not the right word, but because of the privacy and other implications, but just to ensure that we know sort of how the disease is evolving and progressing and moving through communities. As we know, Korea did an excellent job of doing that. And I mean, I was struck, I happened to be in Korea in February, just as sort of the outbreak was picking up steam there. And I was at dinner with some friends, and everybody knew of patient 31. I kept talking about patient 31. And I said, hey, how do you know? That's just, that's crazy that everybody would know about this particular patient. And I guess it was maybe it was one of the Daejeon cases, but it was remarkable that, and I think it just shows the penetration of technology and the reliance on technology to be able to track and trace and squash the disease. And so I think, sort of use of technology, but also the use of tracing. And in fact, I mean, tracing, sometimes it just takes, again, an army of volunteers and others just using shoe leather and picking up the phone and making sure that folks are aware that they might have been infected.
Great, thank you, Tom, for that question, and Mark. We've got a couple more, and these have been asked that I read, in part because we have people calling in from loud coffee shops, to Tom's point that there are loud coffee shops open right now and safe in Seoul. And so the first one, this is another tough one, Mark, but you could have expected this. The extension of the special measures agreement has still not been settled. How are these ongoing discussions on burden sharing, the cost for the presence of USFK, affecting the alliance? Should South Korea, but other countries around Europe, and this is from a European diplomat, be getting nervous about Trump announcing a partial pullout of US troops from Germany?
Well, I mean, I'm going to leave the German question to my European colleagues. And I think, I mean, there was an announcement to that effect, and we saw National Security Advisor O'Brien did an op-ed the other day in the Wall Street Journal about the logic behind the announcement about Germany, and that it was important to be able to be more expeditionary within at least the Asia Pacific. But as for the SMA, look, I mean, I've said before publicly that it has been a frustrating experience to not have the agreement renewed, to have it go, to have it lapse as it has since January 1st. But one thing I would say, though, is really, the seriousness of purpose that both of our countries have right now to get it done. I mean, yes, we haven't quite, we haven't narrowed the gap as much as we should. I think, you've heard me and others say that we, the United States, feels like we've made some significant concessions, and hope that our Korean friends would match that. But I think you've seen, though, some very creative efforts to go into this, and some efforts that I think that help to ensure that our alliance has a high level of readiness. We saw this with the Korean offer and the U.S. acceptance of to pay the costs for Korean workers who had been furloughed for a couple months, but are now back on the job. I think this had been done before. I want to say some 15, 16 years ago, but it is unusual. But I think it reflected a desire to ensure that the United States and the U.S. Forces Korea and the Combined Forces Command, that we were able to maintain readiness in order to be able to honor our treaty commitments to the ROK. But yeah, I mean, we still have work to do on the SMA, and I think I'm confident. I'm absolutely confident that we will find a way to make it happen.
You're doing something right, Mark, because the questions are flowing in here, and there's a couple that are sort of linked. You're asking your North Korea watching skills and interpretation, and so I'm going to ask Robert Feldman if he could ask his question, followed by Kim Gamel from Stars and Stripes. if the two of you could just back to back, your questions are a little bit linked, and then we'll let Marc answer them as a pair, if that's all right. Robert, could we start with you?
Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool, thanks. Actually, I've just put in a couple questions. One relates to domestic politics inside North Korea. There were some reports that perhaps Kim Jong-un was sick. As those came out, the role of his little sister came to the fore. She seemed to be very hawkish. They blew up the interaction center. Now things are rolling back a little bit. Can you give a reading of what's going on there? And then secondly, similar question, but what's happening in domestic politics inside China? That is, how does the interplay between sort of pro and anti-Xi Jinping forces inside China affect what we can expect from China, but also how we deal with the North Korean nuclear issue? Thank you.
All right, and so jot that down, Marc, but let's get Kim Gemo's question as well. Kim, are you there?
Yeah. Hi, John. Hi, Marc. Can you hear me?
Hey, Kim. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Well, actually, I was wondering, Marc, given your expertise, if you could comment on the recent maneuverings by North Korea. And, today there was an announcement that Kim Jong-un chaired a meeting and they're suspending military plans against South Korea. What do you think is the significance of these apparently conflicting messages, considering his sister just a week ago, seemed to unleash the military? And also, in connection with that, it seems the U.S. has been fairly muted in its response to the recent tensions. Do you think this is another effort by North Korea to drive a wedge between the allies?
Well, okay, so those are two excellent questions, both of which I almost feel like I want to punt to John, particularly the Chinese domestic politics one. I am not an expert, so I'm sorry, Robbie, if I can't really take that one on. But as for North Korea, look, I mean, there was a Hollywood producer, a guy named Robert Evans, who's always famously quoted as saying, "Nobody, when it comes to Hollywood, nobody knows nothing." And I think in some ways the same could be said about what's happening, up north. And far be it for me, I'm not gonna try to guess what's happening. It's just someday maybe when we have a chance to examine archives or something, perhaps we'll know better. But I really am hesitant to even venture a guess, and I'm afraid it would just be irresponsible. But just Kim, to your one question though about being muted, I mean, one thing we've been very conscientious about, we the United States government, is that wanting to keep sort of space for diplomacy, wanting to keep the door open for diplomacy, and so I think part of that demands that we ensure that the door stays open and that we don't say things perhaps that might be misconstrued or just anything like that. And so we have been measured, but at the same time, we have to also take steps, as we have been, to ensure that our pressure campaign remains on. What I mean by pressure campaign is continuing, the sanctions, UN Security Council sanctions on the North, and this is not just a U.S. thing. This is the international community that voted for these, and so we'll continue to keep that up. But at the same time, I think just continue to stress whenever and wherever we can that we are committed to dialogue, that we're committed to engagement, but we have to. It takes two to tango, right?
So we're running near the end. I'm afraid Yvonne at any moment is going to appear and de-zoom us. But I wanted to get in one more question, Marc. It's another elephant in the room, but maybe a good elephant, a complicated elephant. For a month now, the United States, in the midst of the pandemic, has been roiled by protests. Some of them violent, but for the most part peaceful. And many would say inspiring, but painful too. And there was a moment as we all saw here, kind of dramatic local moment when the U.S. Embassy put out a Black Lives Matter banner. And I think that resonated quite a bit, actually, was my sense here in South Korea. This is, as you know, very active protest culture, and it's part of the shared values between Americans and South Koreans. But then, of course, the banner was taken down with an explanation that I'm not sure everyone thought was the real story. So it left, I think, ultimately a very positive impression, and USFK also has been very forward in addressing it, and that messaging has gotten across. So I think there's a positive impression from the State Department, but then there's also confusion. So I wonder if you could comment, specifically to Korean audience, but we have others on the line, of kind of how are you managing this? How is the State Department handling the fact that this is a really extraordinary moment in American history? And as a diplomat, how do you take that in all of your conversations abroad, even when they're happening on Zoom like this one?
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you raised it. Well, on the specific issue of the banner, this was, Ambassador Harris, I think, felt very strongly, as many of us do, about the serious problems we have in the United States, about racial injustice, police brutality. These are issues that for too long have gone unaddressed, and I think this was a way to highlight, for our Korean friends, just the depth of passion that we have towards, and the depth of need to resolving and addressing these issues. And there's been some articles. I mean, there was an article in, I forget, it was the New York Times or Politico or something, talking about, how hard it is to be an American diplomat when trying to talk to certain countries about their human rights or religious freedom circumstances. Yet back home, how could you possibly accuse one country of something when you can't even get your own act together domestically in the United States? And actually, I disagree. I think it's sensitive, but I think that now more than ever is a time for American diplomats to be out there and to be explaining openly and honestly about the problems in our country, and to be able to talk about it in a way that invites criticism, that invites disagreement, that invites dissent, but to show that these are all aspects of our country that we welcome and protect. And I think it's a time. It's hard. It's not easy, but it's something I think that we as diplomats can and should be able to take on. I'll never forget when I was serving in Seoul, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, and the Amnesty International people in Seoul wanted to come talk to somebody at the embassy, and I was that somebody. And I thought they were going to come and talk to me about their concerns about the Korean national security law, or their concerns about religious or conscientious objectors not being jailed for not refusing to do military service, whatever. No, these Amnesty International people were coming to talk to me about their campaign against human rights violations in the United States. And this was 15, 20 years ago, and their concerns were everything from the death penalty to treatment of illegal immigrants, people who were caught at the border, and what was happening to them, and a few other things. And as a younger diplomat, it was both very uncomfortable, but ultimately it was important for me to hear that. It was important for me to hear from others sort of how they perceived my country. And so I think it's something. This is absolutely a critical moment, but it's now more than ever. I mean, we need our diplomats, not to shrink away, not to hide or avoid these tough topics, but to just dive right in, because we are, warts and all, we are willing to take on these problems and show the world that we're doing it. And I think it's an absolute contrast to some of the other countries out there that don't. And I think we know who they are.
Well, thanks, Mark. There she is on cue.
Hey, and that concludes today's program. Mark, it was so good to see you again, and
Thank you. Yeah, likewise. I appreciate it.
healthy. And I hope to be able to see you again in person in the near future.
Someday. Yeah.
John, I'll see you soon. And thank you
Yes.
everyone again for joining us today. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, John. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks,
you.
Yvonne.